Hi, welcome back. I'm Joe and this channel is all about the world of business, finance and investment. And in today's video I'm continuing the series looking at the financial implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And today we're focusing in on the airline industry. Now, Russia has a lot of different airlines. Aeroflot is probably the most famous, but they have numerous other airlines that operate both internally and internationally. And the airline industry traditionally uses lease financing. So these are international finance businesses that provide large loans to aircraft operators in order to purchase their planes. And these leases run for long periods of time. And aircraft leases are one of the areas that have been sanctioned as part of the measures that have been introduced by Western governments to inflict punishment on Russia to persuade them to stop the conflict in Ukraine. In the normal course of business, if a lender calls up its loan and requires repayment and you can't afford to repay that, then that lender will step in and seize the asset that it has security over. But obviously the situation with regards to Russia and airplanes right now is quite complicated. Most of the countries around Russia have introduced no-fly zones, so that means that most of the aircraft have been grounded. And of course it's very difficult right now for a leasing company to be able to go in and repossess an aircraft that's sitting on Russian territory. And just to make matters more complicated, Russia have just introduced a new law whereby they are now declaring ownership of all of these aircraft. So in today's video, I'll give you a brief overview of how the airline finance business works. We'll look at the fleet of planes that Russia has that have been leased by international finance businesses. We'll talk about the sanctions that were introduced. We'll look at what efforts the leasing companies have made to repossess these aircraft. We'll talk about the law changes that Russia have just announced. I'll have a look at war insurance, which potentially could cover some of these leasing companies. And then we'll talk about the wider issues relating to the impact on the insurance company, leasing company, the airlines industry, and the general economy. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of all of this are. So before we get into all of that, if I could ask you to give me a thumbs up at some point during this video, if you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate that. And also please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And don't forget, I always include chapters in my videos, so if there's a section that you're not particularly interested in, it's really easy to skip over it and move on to the next. Purchasing a commercial aircraft is extremely expensive. We have a look at this graphic. It shows the current pricing of Boeing aircraft. So you can see that the lowest cost Boeing right now is a 737-700, which would cost you $89.1 million. So that's your entry level if you want to start an airline. But as we work our way down this column, you can see that you're quickly into hundreds of millions of dollars. And the most expensive Boeing right now is a 7779, which would cost you $442 million to buy brand new. So running an airline business requires a huge amount of capital. And one of the problems that airline operators have is that they operate on very low margins. It's a highly competitive industry and most consumers are looking for the lowest price. So when you're looking to book a flight, you'll search around and generally speaking, you'll look for the best deal that you can find. So that means that these guys are constantly under price pressure. So this is a major problem if you're an airline operator because your costs are massive and your margins are very thin. So therefore, you generally have to work on large volumes. So you need to make sure that all your planes are full all of the time. So a business with those characteristics is very difficult to finance. And the way that the industry works is that the vast majority of aircraft that are in the air right now are financed by leases. And in the world of leasing, there are basically two options. Either a straightforward finance lease, which is essentially a loan. So you would work out the cost of the plane and then you would take some finance to help buy that, or an operating lease. And an operating lease is identical to the sort of lease that people use to buy cars these days. Under operating leases, the finance company purchases the plane and owns the aircraft, and then it provides you with a lease to use that craft for a set period of time. So generally speaking, these deals are put in place for less than 10 years. And at the end of the lease period, there will be a residual value and the plane will be returned to the leasing company. And generally what will happen in the aircraft industry is that those planes will then be sold to nations that are happy to buy older aircraft. And the aircraft leasing business is absolutely massive. We are talking hundreds of billions of dollars of finance in existence right now. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, Russia has a lot of different airlines that are operating right now. There are currently 980 passenger jets in service, and 515 of those planes are leased and have a total market value of around $10 billion. Russia has historically been seen as a good client for the airline leasing businesses, and the current exposure is spread across a number of the large operators. AerCap, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, has around 5% of its total fleet leased in Russia, with a total aircraft value of around $2.5 billion. At the end of February, the European Union announced that all leasing companies had to terminate their lease arrangements with Russian companies by March the 28th. Now, this announcement was part of the wider sanctions that were announced against Russia in order to cause financial problems for Russia and encourage the authorities to end the conflict in Ukraine. Now, for a lot of other companies, the sanctions have been relatively straightforward, but for airline leasing businesses, this presented a major problem because the vast majority of the planes that are leased by Russia are actually on Russian territory right now. We saw a no-fly zone introduced all around Europe, and that meant the grounding of a lot of Russian planes. Now, usually in circumstances where a lease company announces termination of the lease, the company that is holding the asset would then be required to hand over that asset. Now, clearly we've got a very unusual situation here because the Russian companies that are operating these planes have been paying these leases, so they haven't actually defaulted on the lease. And from their perspective, they want to carry on using those planes. So essentially what we're seeing here is the leasing companies trying to call an end to the lease arrangement early and then trying to repossess the asset that relates to that lease. In Cape Town in 2001, a conference was held amongst the aviation industry to talk about the issue of trying to recover assets in the event of failure to pay. And an agreement was subsequently signed by 65 nations around the world, agreeing to protocols that would be operated in the event of having to repossess aircraft. Russia is a party to the Cape Town Convention and has agreed to operate under these protocols. So there are agreed principles in place as to what should happen in the event that an airline business fails and is unable to pay the operating lease. We now have very strict rules as to how the finance companies, the leasing companies, can repossess that aircraft. However, the current situation is highly complicated. Firstly, a lot of the aircraft relating to these Russian leases are sitting on Russian soil. And because there is a no-fly zone operating all around Russia, it's impossible to be able to move those aircraft. If you did send a team into Russia to take that aircraft and bring it back to one of the other countries around Europe, it's impossible to actually fly without causing major security concerns. The second issue around this point is the geopolitical problems, that it is currently impossible to be able to send in a recovery team to Russia. And the third issue that we've got here is that Russia hasn't actually defaulted on the payment of these leases. So from the Russian company's perspective, they believe that they are still current in terms of meeting their financial obligations, and therefore the leasing companies do not have the right to be able to repossess these planes. This is a sanction that's been brought in by the authorities. Another complicating factor is that under international law, you can't just repossess an aircraft and then sell it to another airline operator. You need all of the associated paperwork. So you actually need some collaboration with the Russian businesses who are operating these planes. They need to actually sign over all of the paperwork and hand it back to the leasing company in order to give them full ownership and then be able to sell that plane on. Now, clearly at the moment, the Russian companies are not happy to enter into those discussions. They don't want to hand these aircraft back, and therefore they're not prepared to hand over the paperwork, which would give full ownership back to the leasing company. So we've got a real conundrum here. Now, there are a handful of Russian aircraft that are currently sitting outside of Russia, and there have been some attempts to repossess these planes. So far, 2 jets have been seized, one in Istanbul and one in Mexico City. However, there's also been some failed repossession attempts, one in Southeast Asia and another in Egypt. Russian authorities have now responded to this action against all of the Russian airline operators and introduced new legislation which allows foreign planes leased by Russian airlines to be registered as the airline's property and for them to be given Russian airworthiness certificates. So essentially what Russia is doing here is seizing ownership of all of these aircraft and re-registering them as Russian planes. And the reason that they're doing that is that you have to have certification to be able to fly your planes around the world. So if the international restrictions are lifted in the future and an Aeroflot plane flies to New York, it would not be allowed to fly back to Russia because the American aerospace authorities would deem it to not have any registration. It wouldn't have the right certification to be able to take off. However, if these planes are re-registered as Russian and the Russian authorities then issue certification saying that the plane is registered and therefore it's legal and it has met all the requirements for international flight, then technically the US authorities would have to let that plane take off again because it would have international documentation saying that it was safe and registered and legal. So that's what Russia is trying to achieve here. It's trying to change the registration of these planes and it's also trying to take possession of the ownership. Now clearly this unilateral decision by Russia does not sit well with the international airline industry. And the United Nations Airline Agency have stated that any dual registration of foreign-owned aircraft leased by Russian carriers would be inconsistent with Article 18 of the 1944 Convention on International Civil Aviation, known as the Chicago Convention, which says an aircraft cannot be validly registered in more than one state. Now, the interesting position here is that there is no actual international law that stipulates that you can't register in two countries. It's a standard that's been set by the International Civil Aviation Organization. Now, the ICAO has 193 member states, including Russia, and so far all of them operate under these agreed standards. However, it isn't actually legislation. So the aircraft leasing industry is potentially facing losses of billions of dollars. But there is some potential hope for the leasing companies. In the contracts that they have, there is the concept of war insurance. So in the event of the declaration of a war, the leasing companies can claim against their insurance companies and get full repayment of their outstanding loans. Now, obviously, in terms of the financial world, that just passes the buck from the leasing companies over to the insurance companies. Somebody is still going to have to pay for these planes that have been stolen by the Russian airlines. But one of the questions here is, what is the definition of war? And does the Russian invasion of Ukraine constitute an actual war in relation to these aircraft? Now, insurers have said that a declaration of war is not necessarily required to claim under war risk policy, with nationalisation, seizure and restraint under government orders also covered. However, it's likely that the insurance industry will counter these claims. They won't want to hand over billions of dollars for the payment of these aircraft, especially as the forfeiture of these leases relates directly to sanctions rather than the declaration of war. So somebody's going to have to pay at some point for all of this, but it's bound to be a long drawn out fight through the courts as to who actually foots the bill. As well as the direct losses from the leasing industry, there are a variety of other knock-on implications for what's going on right now with regards to Russian airlines for the whole of the business world. So there will be some direct negative impacts for the aircraft manufacturers. So Boeing and Airbus are the two largest in the world, and they will have an order book with Russian airlines. So clearly going forward, those orders will not be fulfilled. As it sits at the moment, Russia is completely sanctioned and therefore there will be no future purchasing of any aircraft. So those two companies will lose direct future sales. But in addition to that, they have a really large parts and servicing operation. So when you run an airline, you have to keep maintaining all of your aircraft. And that requires the purchase of a lot of spares and parts. Every time an aircraft takes a flight, it will have to be serviced and you have to replace various parts on a regular basis. And the purchase of all of these supplemental parts provides a huge amount of profit to the aircraft manufacturers. These products are high margin because once you've bought a Boeing aircraft, you can only use official Boeing equipment to keep maintaining that aircraft. So make sure you're in compliance with all the certification. So this is a lucrative part of the industry for those businesses that will now no longer be continuing. In addition to the sale of new aircraft, there are also a lot of second-hand aircraft that are used in Russia. And in the industry, when an aircraft is taken out of commission by one of the developed countries, the lease companies will then look to sell that same aircraft into an emerging or developing nation. And Russia has been a country that has been buying second-hand aircraft. So clearly going forward, that will no longer continue either. And then finally, we've got the implications of less flights. So when you have less flights to and from Russia, that means that all of the ancillary businesses that rely upon volume of air traffic will suffer. So the airports will see less business. The retailers who operate in those airports will see less business. The baggage handlers will see less volume. The people who drive taxis to and from airports will see a reduction in their volumes. The hotels that rely upon that business will also see a fall in demand. So there's a number of different interlinked businesses that feed into the wider economy that will see a reduction in volumes and revenue and profit going forward because of the loss of all of the traffic with Russia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, clearly the sanctions that have been brought in against Russian airlines are going to have quite a big financial impact on the global economy. The direct impacts on the leasing companies and the aircraft manufacturers is quite clear to see. And the knock-on impact of that will be felt across the whole of the global economy. But one of the bigger issues that's coming out of this video today is the new law that the Russian authorities have introduced, whereby they are now declaring that all of the Russian airlines own the aircraft that they've previously been leasing. So essentially what they're saying is, we don't care that there are some debts in place and that these international finance businesses own these aircraft. We are now taking ownership of them. So they're writing off the debt, they're writing off all of their obligations, and they're seizing control of that asset. And that really sets a precedent for all of the rest of the businesses in Russia. I recently talked about the new bankruptcy laws that had been introduced in Russia, whereby any overseas business that was declaring that they wanted to exit from their operations, the Russian authorities could fast-track bankruptcy of that business and then hand control either to the state or to the managers of that company. So essentially they were doing the same sort of thing as we're talking about here. They were announcing that they were then taking over all of that business. And I think that looks like the precedent that's being set across the board for Russia. They are now nationalizing a lot of the industries that are owned by foreign entities. And with this new law on the planes, they're essentially putting down a marker that says, do not try to recover any of your debt. Do not try to take action against any Russian businesses that has obligations to you, because we will just change the rules of the game. We will declare that we now own those assets and that your debt is invalid. So this is a really aggressive tactic that Russia are taking. They're cutting their ties with the rest of the world. No foreign business will be comfortable getting involved with any Russian companies because there's now this political risk that the authorities in Russia can change the rules of the game, can change the laws, and suddenly declare that those assets are Russian owned and therefore your debt and your ownership is no longer valid. So that is a really big move by Russia. It's another step in the move away from international trade and international relations and moving back towards that old nationalistic idea of Russia. So hopefully you found today's content useful, interesting and informative. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching and I will see you again soon.